The Sega Genesis got off to a sluggish start. It made its international debut in Japan in October 1988 with only 2 launch titles. Things would not be much better by the time of its release in North America in August of the following year. Altered Beast, an arcade game with a respectable following in Western markets, became a third piece of software available for the system. While these games certainly have their fans, and that is a fact I do respect, the general consensus at the time was that they were of mediocre quality. I can't speak to these two because I've never played them before, but I have played Altered Beast quite extensively, and, in my humble opinion, I do think that description largely fits the bill. It has its charm, but it's extremely repetitive, and looking at it today, it very much shows its age. More than a year into its life, the Genesis simply didn't have the games to rile up interest and excitement from a wider audience. That narrative began to change in late 1989, one of the main reasons being the Revenge of Shinobi. Show any interest in diving into the Genesis's library, and chances are you'll hear about the Shinobi franchise. These 2 games in particular are often regarded as among the best of Sega's 16-bit offerings. One, if not both, are often included in a top 10 list of the Genesis's best games. Its reputation precedes it, and I was eager to get some hands-on experience. The Revenge of Shinobi released in Japan and North America in December 1989, and PAL territories in spring of 1990. It's a sequel to Sega's 1987 Shinobi arcade title, which features Joe Musashi, a ninja from the Obra clan, and follows him on his quest to rescue kidnapped children from the clutches of the nefarious Zed gang. The sequel is set 3 years later, where the defeated gang's remnants reunite, style themselves Neo-Zed, and look to eliminate the threat posed by those who possess the power of stealth. They decimate the Obra clan and take Naoko, Musashi's bride-to-be, hostage. Our protagonist sets out to defeat the vile crime syndicate once again, but this time his goal is personal: rescue his love and avenge his fallen brothers and sisters. The Revenge of Shinobi makes a stellar first impression with its presentation. Of course, it does show its age in certain parts. The character sprites are a bit jagged for my taste, and sometimes the backgrounds are on the blander side of things. Its successor, Shinobi 3, featured a vibrant color palette that is more to my liking, though I understand that some prefer this game's grittier feel. I also noticed that it had trouble playing multiple sounds at once. It would often prioritize one over the other. Regardless, that's where my gripes end. This is one of the first games I've seen that has parallax scrolling. Different levels of the foreground and background scroll across the screen at different speeds, creating an enhanced sense of depth. I also love the dynamism in the environments. In the first stage, the time of day changes from dusk to night mid-gameplay, and leaves blow across the screen to simulate strong gusts of wind. But what takes the cake in terms of presentation is easily Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack. Speaking in general terms, video game music up to this point was serviceable. You might bop your foot to it or hum it when going about your business, but that was basically the extent of it. The Revenge of Shinobi soundtrack, by contrast, is something you'd actively try to listen to even after turning off the console. It helped establish video games as a more legitimate medium for music consumption. Not every song is a smash hit, but what's here isn't just good video game music, it's good music period. Here's a selection of some of my favorites. One of the game's weirdest traits is its inclusion of familiar faces. There's this guy who looks eerily similar to the Hulk, and he turns into the Terminator in his last boss phase, and, of all things, yes, Pink Spider-Man. Earlier versions of the game included Rambo, Batman, and Godzilla. This got Sega in hot water, who obviously had to remove some of these in iterative revisions because of licensing issues. None of this was meant to be. Nariyoshi Oba, the game's director, drew these characters to serve as rough examples for potential bosses and enemies. The sprite designers clearly misunderstood his instructions and recreated his sketches a little too faithfully. The same team that created the arcade game came back to work on its sequel, and they gave a lot of thought on how to translate the original's gameplay style to consoles. These kinds of games are designed in fundamentally different ways. In the arcades, you're trying to hook people in with flashy visuals and fun yet easy to grasp controls. You're not expecting them to play for a prolonged period of time, rather your goal is to separate them from those few arcade coins they have in their pockets. Players have a vastly different set of expectations when it comes to console games. They expect the game to have more depth and they want a longer runtime, mainly because they're much more expensive than their arcade counterparts. The development team made slight tweaks and additions to the game's core mechanics to accommodate that desire. First, Musashi now has a health bar. This was absent in the first game. One hit and he was dead. He also now has a limited number of throwing stars. You can replenish both of these by destroying the small crates found throughout each level, which also house power-ups and additional lives. But you have to be careful. Some of them are booby-trapped with timed explosives. Stumble onto them in the wrong spot and it could well cost you a life. The Revenge of Shinobi is a difficult game, even on the normal setting. This was done on purpose. The developers wanted to stump players and make them think about what they could do differently to pass a particular challenge. Often this involves using one of 4 ninja powers or ninjutsu arts available to Musashi. Fushin substantially increases his jump height, allowing him to access areas that at first glance seem impossible to reach. Karyu showers the screen with columns of flame, inflicting massive damage to nearby enemies. Mijin has a similar purpose but is more powerful in terms of damage output and instantly refills Musashi's ninjutsu stock, but at the cost of a life. Ikazushi covers Musashi in a shield of lightning and absorbs up to 4 attacks. While the difficulty is brutal and punishing, I never found it unfair. Plus, unless you're playing on the original hardware, you'll have access to save states so you can make checkpoints for yourself. And even if you are playing on a Genesis, you can decrease the game's difficulty and increase the number of throwing stars at your disposal. The game has a strong diversity in level design. It helps keep things fresh, especially in successive playthroughs. As far as I can tell, there are 4 basic level types. First, there's the action stages. The main danger is on-screen enemies, there's secrets tucked away in nooks and crannies, and there's usually alternate routes. Second, the platforming stages. These will test your reflexes and mastery of the double jump. The main focus is precision and movement while avoiding bottomless pits or incoming obstacles. These levels generally have a healthy dose of adversaries whose purpose is to disrupt your platforming. Third, the dungeons. They take place underground, have multiple branching paths, some of which lead to dead ends and are teeming with bad guys. You'll generally have to slow the pace down and tread cautiously. Finally, the gauntlets. These are straight shots to the end. They include a foreground-background dichotomy that you can jump between at will. Enemies and obstacles in one layer can't affect anything in the other, so it's a good opportunity to catch a breather and collect leftover items. Of course, each stage concludes with a boss encounter. These are fine. Most are challenging and engaging, but others can be easily cheesed. The Revenge of Shinobi isn't without its more major flaws though. The double jump is surprisingly difficult to pull off in a game that will ask you time and time again to be very precise with your platforming. You have to press the jump button when you're at the apex of your initial jump to execute it successfully. Press it a frame too early or too late and you'll plummet to the ground. Bottomless pits are introduced as early as stage 2, so these kinds of mistakes will cost you a life early and often. To be fair, it's not that bad once you get a hang of the timing, but I was still having trouble with it when my attention was on something like a nearby enemy or obstacle. The end game is grueling, especially for newcomers. In stage 7, there's this bit that requires a frame-perfect jump. Failure will result in an instant death, forcing you back to the beginning of the level. The platforms include small rafts floating on water, and ninjas will appear from places you couldn't possibly anticipate. Get hit in the wrong spot, and it's another insta-death. And finally, the last stage is obtuse and absolutely brutal to first-time players. It's a dungeon that has side doors that take you to different parts of the level. You're supposed to figure out which doors lead you where, but there's a lot of them, and the new rooms and pathways look identical to the ones you just left. After about an hour of mindless wandering, I called it quits and watched a long play. It turns out I was more or less on the right path, but it would have taken me hours to figure out, and I wasn't about to spend my time doing that. Having said that, these shortcomings didn't taint the experience for me. The stellar presentation, fantastic soundtrack, depth in gameplay, and solid level design, with a few exceptions at the end to be sure, more than make up for them. The Revenge of Shinobi, in my view, is still worth playing today. This has been Scott from Tilly the Lad. Thanks everyone for watching. Until next time, take care.